Ida for telling my 24-year-old daughter that she has to get a job if she wants to move back home? I have 3 kids, each unique in their own way, each a reflection of the life choices they've made and the values my wife and I tried to instill in them over the years. My oldest daughter, now 36 years old, has always been the picture of responsibility and stability. From a young age, she was the type of child who color-coded her school notes and planned her future down to the smallest detail. After high school, she went straight to college, earned her degree with honors, married her college sweetheart, and settled down in a charming suburban neighborhood. Her house, a picturesque 2-story with a neatly trimmed lawn and a white picket fence, stands as a testament to her diligent planning and careful decision-making. She now has 2 children of her own, a boy and a girl, and watching her parent with the same structure and care she brought to her own life fills me with a quiet sense of pride. My son, 5 years younger than his sister at 31, took a slightly different path but ended up in a similarly stable place. He was always the more adventurous one, drawn to sports, outdoors, and activities that tested his limits. As a teenager, he was the one who pushed boundaries, sneaking out with friends and testing curfews, but he never strayed too far. There was a solid core to him, a sense of responsibility that always pulled him back. After high school, he joined a local community college, unsure at first of what direction to take, but soon found his passion in mechanical engineering. He now runs a successful auto repair business with a loyal clientele, and his garage is often filled with the sound of clinking tools and the hum of engines. He, too, married young and now has a family of his own, with a toddler who seems to have inherited his father's boundless energy and love for adventure. Then there's my youngest daughter, the one who has always been a whirlwind of creativity, rebellion, and free spirit. She is 24 now, the baby of the family, though that label hardly seems to fit anymore. Even as a child, she stood out from her siblings in every possible way. Where my oldest daughter preferred structure and order, my youngest thrived in chaos and spontaneity. Her bedroom walls were a constantly evolving canvas of posters, sketches, and paint splatters, a reflection of her ever-changing interests and moods. She was the child who could spend hours lost in her own world, sketching fantastical creatures in her notebooks or creating elaborate stories about far-off lands and daring adventures. As she grew older, her creative spirit only intensified. While her siblings followed the expected path of college and careers, she took a different route. After graduating from high school, she announced her intention to travel, to see the world, and to live life on her own terms. At first, my wife and I were hesitant. We worried about her safety, about the lack of a clear plan, but we also understood that trying to hold her back would only make her more determined to break free. So we supported her as best we could, offering advice and financial help when needed, and watched from afar as she embarked on her journey of self-discovery. Her travels took her to places I'd only ever seen in travel documentaries. She sent postcards from the bustling streets of Tokyo, the serene beaches of Bali, and the ancient ruins of Athens. Each card came with a story of strangers who became friends, of lessons learned, of challenges faced and overcome. She lived out of a backpack, stayed in hostels, and often relied on the kindness of strangers. She found ways to support herself along the way, from selling her artwork in street markets to taking on odd jobs like dog sitting and freelance writing. Her resilience and resourcefulness amazed me, even as her choices sometimes baffled me. But there were aspects of her life that made me uncomfortable, choices she made that clashed with the values my wife and I tried to instill. She embraced a lifestyle that was far removed from the stability and security her siblings had chosen. One of the most contentious points was her decision to create content online, in ways that my wife and I didn't fully understand and certainly didn't approve of. It was a different world, one that felt foreign and unsettling to me, but I tried to remind myself that she was an adult, capable of making her own decisions. Still, it was hard to reconcile the image of my little girl with some of the things I knew she was doing to make ends meet. Despite our differences, I remained proud of her. Proud of her courage, her independence, her refusal to conform to expectations. She was living a life that was authentically hers, a life that, while unconventional, brought her experiences and stories that most people could only dream of. Yet, in the back of my mind, there was always a lingering worry. A fear that her lifestyle, while exciting and adventurous now, might not provide the stability and security she would need as she got older. This worry came to a head when she returned from her most recent trip, a journey that took her to Thailand. We hadn't seen her in months, and when she called to say she was coming home, my wife and I were eager to welcome her back. We drove to the airport to pick her up, the excitement of seeing her again mingled with the usual concern about what news she might bring. She came through the arrivals gate looking as vibrant and carefree as ever, her suitcase covered in stickers from the places she'd visited. We hugged her tightly, relieved to have her home safe. It was during the car ride home that she dropped the bombshell. She casually mentioned that she hadn't renewed her apartment lease before leaving for Thailand and, as a result, now had nowhere to go. My wife and I exchanged a glance, the implications of her words sinking in. I asked her what her plan was, and she shrugged, saying she was hoping to stay with us for a while until she figured things out. My wife, ever the nurturing mother, immediately said yes, of course she could stay. And I agreed. I would never let my daughter live on the streets or bounce from couch to couch when we had a large, comfortable house with plenty of space. But as much as I wanted to help her, I also felt it was important to set some boundaries. I didn't want her to see our home as a permanent solution, a safety net that would allow her to continue drifting without any sense of responsibility. So I told her she would need to contribute financially, to pay rent. The words were barely out of my mouth when her expression changed. She looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and betrayal, as if I'd suggested something outrageous. She asked how much I expected her to pay, and when I said $500 a month, she reacted as if I'd slapped her. Her voice rose, the frustration and anger spilling out as she explained that she didn't have a steady job and couldn't afford that kind of rent. I listened calmly, then told her what I believed to be the simple solution: find a job. Her reaction only intensified. She accused me of being unsupportive, of caring more about money than her well-being. The argument reached its peak when she insinuated that I wouldn't care if she had to resort to desperate measures, like selling her body again, as long as she paid the rent. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure, and responded as evenly as I could. How she earned a living was none of my business. It was a harsh thing to say, and I regretted it as soon as the words left my mouth. But I was frustrated, torn between wanting to help my daughter and wanting her to take responsibility for her life. She just got back from a trip to Thailand, sun-kissed and carefree, her luggage stuffed with souvenirs from a life lived on her own terms. My wife and I stood at the arrivals gate, watching passengers trickle through. It had been months since we'd seen her, and despite our differences and the worry that followed her choices like a shadow, there was always that familiar joy in seeing her walk through those doors. She emerged with her suitcase in tow, her long hair falling in loose waves, and a confident, almost rebellious smile on her face. She looked the same vibrant, full of stories yet to be told, but there was a heaviness in her eyes I couldn't quite place. We hugged tightly, my wife clinging to her as if she might slip away again. There was comfort in having her home, even if just for a little while. The car ride back was filled with chatter about her adventures, the temples she visited, the food she tried, the people she met. It sounded magical, like something pulled from a travel magazine, but I couldn't shake the nagging thought in the back of my mind: what's next? I knew my daughter well enough to know that her plans often ended where the adventure did, and she rarely had a clear next step in mind. As we pulled into the driveway, she dropped the bombshell, her tone casual, as if it wasn't the life-altering news it was. "Oh, by the way," she began, "I didn't renew my lease before I left, so I don't have an apartment anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded with implications. My wife and I exchanged a glance. I could see the concern flicker across her face, but my wife, ever the nurturing mother, immediately stepped in. "Well, you'll stay here with us, of course," she said without hesitation. I nodded in agreement because what else could I say? I wasn't going to let my daughter, my baby girl, fend for herself with nowhere to go. But at the same time, a quiet voice inside me reminded me of all the conversations we'd had before about responsibility, stability, planning for the future. She was 24 now, no longer a child, and while I loved her fiercely, I also knew we couldn't keep providing a safety net forever. As we carried her bags inside, I asked the question that had been circling my mind since she made her announcement. "So, what's your plan now?" She shrugged, tossing her coat over the back of the couch. "I'm figuring it out," she said, her voice light, as if figuring it out was as simple as flipping a switch. "I was hoping I could stay here for a bit while I sort things out." Again, my wife jumped in before I could respond. "Of course, sweetheart. You can stay as long as you need." And while I agreed in principle after all, I wasn't about to turn my daughter away. There was a part of me that felt uneasy. We had been down this road before, offering her a place to stay, only for her to slip into a pattern of drifting through life without direction. I didn't want to see her fall into that cycle again. She was capable, intelligent, and resourceful, but she needed to learn that life required a balance between freedom and responsibility. As we settled into the living room, I cleared my throat and said, as gently as I could, "We're happy to have you stay, but I think it's fair to ask for a contribution. You will need to pay rent." Her head snapped toward me, her eyes wide with disbelief. It was as if I had said something utterly foreign to her. "Rent?" she echoed, incredulous. "Seriously?" "Yes, seriously," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "We're not asking for much, but we think it's important for you to contribute something. Let's say $500 a month." The reaction was immediate. Her face twisted in shock, her voice rising in protest. $500? I don't even have a steady job right now. How am I supposed to afford that? I didn't waver. "You will need to find work," I said simply. "You've always found ways to support yourself before. This is no different." But to her, it was different. She stared at me as if I had betrayed her, as if the very idea of asking her to pay rent was some form of cruelty. "I just got back from traveling," she said, exasperated. "I don't have anything lined up yet. You're expecting me to magically find a job overnight." "You have a month," I reminded her. "1 month to settle in, figure things out, and start looking. After that, we'll expect you to contribute." She crossed her arms, retreating into silence, a storm brewing behind her eyes. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the stubbornness I knew so well. She wasn't one to be told what to do, and I knew this conversation wasn't over. Later that evening, my wife and I talked quietly in the kitchen. She agreed with me, to an extent. She understood why I felt it was important for our daughter to take responsibility, but she also worried about pushing too hard. "She's always been different," my wife said, stirring a pot on the stove. "She's not like the other two. She needs space to figure things out in her own way." "I know," I replied, leaning against the counter. "But that doesn't mean we can let her drift forever. She needs a push." The next morning, our daughter barely acknowledged me. She moved through the house with a quiet resentment, avoiding eye contact and brushing past me with curt nods. The tension was palpable, hanging in the air like a storm cloud. I hated it, the silence, the distance, but I wasn't going to back down. A few days passed, and she still hadn't spoken to me. My wife tried to bridge the gap, encouraging her to sit with us at dinner or join us for coffee, but our daughter remained aloof. I caught snippets of her conversations with friends over the phone, and I could hear the frustration in her voice as she vented about the unfair expectations placed on her. One afternoon, she came downstairs, her phone in hand, her expression guarded. "So, you don't care what kind of job I get?" she asked abruptly, her tone challenging. I looked up from my newspaper, meeting her gaze. What do you mean? She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. You said it doesn't matter how I make money, as long as I pay rent. That's what you care about, right? I frowned, sensing where this was going. I want you to find something that works for you, I said carefully. Something that doesn't compromise your well-being. She snorted, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. Yet, because that worked out so well for me before. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. We're not trying to make this harder for you. We just want you to take some responsibility. That's all. The conversation ended there, but her words lingered. I knew she was referencing her past, the choices she had made to support herself, choices we hadn't agreed with. And while I didn't want her to feel forced back into that lifestyle, I also couldn't let her continue drifting aimlessly. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the house remained. She stayed upstairs most of the time, coming down only for meals or brief conversations with her mother. I tried to bridge the gap, offering to help her look for jobs or suggesting ways she could use her creativity to earn a living, but she remained distant. And so, we found ourselves at an impasse, both of us stubborn in our own way, both of us wanting something from the other that neither was willing to fully give. My wife agrees with me that our daughter needs to contribute something, not because we need the money, but because it's important that she doesn't fall into the mindset that she can freeload forever. We've seen it happen in other families, grown children who never launch, who stay in their parents' homes indefinitely, drifting through life without ever learning the value of responsibility. That's not the future we want for our daughter, no matter how much we love her. But there's a delicate balance between helping her and enabling her, and I'm walking a tightrope trying to figure out which side of that line we're on. Still, my wife thinks I've taken it too far by telling her she needs to get a job immediately. She worries that I'm being too rigid, too focused on tough love, when maybe what our daughter needs right now is a softer approach. We've talked about it late at night after our daughter has retreated upstairs, the silence in the house stretching out like a chasm between us. My wife's voice is calm but filled with concern. Maybe she just needs time, she says softly. She's been through a lot. Maybe we should ease up, give her space to figure things out. But how much space is too much? How long do we wait before expectations become necessary? These are the questions that keep me awake at night. I don't want to push her away, but I also can't ignore the nagging feeling that if we let her coast now, she'll never learn to stand on her own 2 feet. The part that stings the most is when she insinuates that I don't care how she makes money as long as she pays us. It's a cruel accusation, one that cuts deeper than I'd like to admit, because it forces me to confront the part of myself that wonders if maybe I've come across that way. In her mind, my insistence on rent means I'm willing to turn a blind eye to whatever means she uses to come up with the money. She dredged up her past, the times she'd done online work that neither my wife nor I approved of, work that, frankly, we didn't want to know too much about. It was a sore subject, one we'd danced around in the past but never fully addressed. When she threw that accusation at me, I said, in a moment of frustration, how you earn a living is none of my business. And I meant it, at least. I thought I did. But the moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Because, deep down, it is my business. She's my daughter. Of course, it's my business if the way she's earning money is hurting her. And I know it did. She doesn't talk about it much, but I saw the toll it took on her, the exhaustion in her eyes, the guarded way she spoke about her work, the way she seemed to shrink into herself during that time. She quit that line of work eventually, but the shadow of it still lingers. And now, with my insistence on rent, she seems to think I'm pushing her back into it. That's not what I want. It's never been what I wanted. I don't want her to feel desperate. I don't want her to think that her only worth is tied to what she can sell. I want her to find her way, to build a life that makes her proud, to find work that fulfills her, not drains her. I've tried to help her find better jobs. I've sat with her, helped her craft resumes, suggested career paths, even encouraged her to go back to school. I've offered to let her live with us for free if she's pursuing something meaningful, something that could give her a stable future. But every time I make those suggestions, she brushes them off, calling them boring or too conventional. She doesn't want to follow the beaten path. She wants to carve out her own way, to chase dreams and adventures. I admire her spirit, her refusal to settle for a life that doesn't excite her. But life isn't always exciting. Sometimes, it's about putting in the hard work, making sacrifices, building a foundation for the future. That's the part she doesn't seem to grasp. As the days go by, the tension in the house grows. She's living upstairs, barely speaking to me. I hear her moving around up there, pacing, talking quietly on the phone. My wife tries to mediate, encouraging her to come down for meals, to sit with us, to talk things through. But our daughter resists. Her pride is wounded, and I know her well enough to understand that it'll take time for her to come around. I wonder, sometimes, if I've failed her as a father. If my focus on practicality and responsibility has pushed her further away instead of guiding her toward a better future. Parenting doesn't come with a manual, and with each of our kids, we've had to figure it out as we go. Our two older children followed more traditional paths, and they seem happy, stable, secure. But our youngest has always been different, always challenging us to rethink what success and stability really mean. One night, I find myself sitting alone in the living room, staring at a family photo on the mantel. It's from years ago, when all three kids were still at home, before life became so complicated. I remember the laughter, the chaos of raising a house full of kids. I remember my youngest daughter's endless energy, her creativity, the way she used to draw on the walls and create entire worlds out of her imagination. Somewhere along the way, that wild spirit clashed with the realities of adulthood, and now we're at an impasse. The next morning, my wife and I sit down to talk. We need to have another conversation with her, she says. Together? As a united front? I nod. It's time. The silent standoff can't go on forever. We need to find a way to move forward, not just for her sake, but for ours, too. That evening, we call her down. She appears in the doorway, arms crossed, wary. I can see the tension in her posture, the guarded look in her eyes. My wife speaks first, her voice gentle but firm. We love you. We want to help you. But we also need you to understand that you have to take some responsibility for your future. I chime in, my tone softer than it's been in weeks. We're not trying to make your life harder. We just want to see you build a life that makes you happy and secure. We don't want you to feel desperate. We don't want you to feel like you have to go back to things that hurt you. Her expression softens slightly, but she still looks uncertain. I just feel like you don't understand me, she says quietly. You want me to be like them, she gestures toward the photo on the mantel, but I'm not. I'm different. We know, my wife says. And we love you for it. But different doesn't mean you can't also have stability. It doesn't mean you can't find work that fulfills you and gives you security. We sit in silence for a moment, the tension easing just a bit. There's still a long way to go, still wounds to heal and trust to rebuild. But it's a start. Later that night, as I lie in bed, I think about what it means to be a parent, the balance between love and tough love, between support and accountability. It's a delicate dance, one that we never truly master. But as long as we keep trying, keep reaching out, there's always hope. And that's what I hold on to. A hope. Hope that she'll find her way, that she'll see we're not against her but with her, every step of the way.